Well, we've been looking at the first Paul, John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg, and looking at the thesis that they're going to develop in this course. And basically it is this, that if we read the letters of Paul, we see three distinctive theological perspectives. The first they refer to as the authentic Paul, and that corresponds to the 7 recognized authentic letters that scholars believe came from the hand of Paul himself. But then as these letters move historically away from the death of Paul, 60 to 65, somewhere in that area, people are still writing in the same vein, using the name of Paul, and writing and thinking they're writing his theology. So they come to be known as the disputed letters. Ephesians and Colossians, particularly, are the ones that we've been looking at. But another of the disputed letters is 2 Thessalonians. And then yet another generation removed, there are letters that are attributed to Paul. Typically, they're First Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And these are letters written by the author that our authors are referring to as the reactionary Paul. And with each step removed from the Apostle Paul, you see a more conservative view in terms of wanting to maintain the status quo of what Roman society and Roman values were like at the time. So the radical Paul really, as we will see, preached a message that was, as the name implies, radical and anti-Rome, really, and offered an alternative perspective to what it meant to live in the Roman Empire. But as we move towards, the disputed letters, and then on through into the inauthentic letters, those that were certainly not written by Paul, we see a more of a conciliatory attitude towards the Romans, and starting to take on some of the Roman values. We saw this with Paul's understanding of slavery, and we also saw this with respect to Paul's understanding of patriarchy. And this is where we left off last time, reading about the radical Paul's view of patriarchy. And this is one of those favorite places that women just love to hear. I'm going to be reading from Titus, if I can find the place of the reactionary Paul here. And I want to read it because we're going to see how it comes up, interestingly, in one of the authentic letters of Paul, almost word for word in a lot of ways. So Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty, provided that the woman continues in love and faith with modesty. Now, that is a pretty standard view of what is called a hierarchical relationship in the family, where men are the ones who have the authority, men are the ones who have the voice, and women are submissive. Now, in the present church, and we're talking about the various denominations in the church, there are 2 models of family life, and they're pretty clear. One is called the egalitarian model, and the other is called the complementary model, the complementary. In other words, in the first model, men and women are seen as having equal roles, equal sense of identity in terms of roles that they play and authority in the household. Decisions are made together, and there is an equality between the husband and the wife. The complementary model is the much more conservative model, and one that is reflected here in these reactionary and pseudo-Pauline letters. And that is that men have their roles and women have their roles as well. Men, according to the patriarchal model, have the authority. Women have to be submissive and, ask. This is the one I like. Permit no woman to teach or have no authority. If she wants to, she has to keep silent and to learn in submission. If they want to know anything, they can ask their husbands. That's the complementary model. And I think it's really interesting. I was looking at some statistics. The Pew Research Center does a lot of surveys of people in churches and denominations, and they do a lot of denominational studies. And these were some charts that I pulled up that I thought were pretty interesting with respect to where we are in terms of Christians and their understanding of, male and female roles in the household. This chart over on the far left is a very recent chart. I think it's 2018. It doesn't say on here, but if you look at it, you can see very clearly that there has been a shift from the complementary model to the egalitarian model with respect to generations. This lightest green color down here is the over 65 generation. This next green is the boomer, and the darker green is the Gen X, and finally the millennials. So 72% of the millennials, I should say, for example here, believe that husband and wife both have jobs. They both take care of the house and children. It's divided equally. Now that has gone up about 9% from what the previous generation, Gen X, believes, which has gone up another 4% from what the previous generation believed about this. So we've seen, at least socially, this move toward a more egalitarian understanding of the roles that men and women play. Up above, the model where the husband provides and the wife takes care of the children. Among the 65 plus people, 37% believe that to be true. By the time you get to the millennials, only 22% of the millennials believe that that these traditional roles of husband, provider, and woman caretaker hold anymore. So this is a slip. Now conservatives look at this. Conservative Christians look at this and see this as the breakdown of society. Right? This really started with Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and others, and so they want to. When you want to talk about reactionary and being reactionary in the truest sense of the form, wanting to truest sense of the word, wanting to hold on to, the values of conservative values of the status quo. This is the kind of thing that scares evangelicals who are engaged in our current culture wars. When you look, first of all, any questions or comments about that? Really, I love looking at statistics. I'll try to save you from that love of mine. When we look at divorce rates, now there's another group, the well-respected group, associated mostly with evangelical but moderate evangelical denominations called the Barna Research Group. They did a study recently on divorce rates by denomination. And what they found is that the non-denominational churches, they're the ones that have this more complementary model of men being the provider and women being the caretaker. The divorce rates in non-denominational churches and Baptist churches, which tend to support that model, are higher by about 10% when you get down to the Methodists and Presbyterian, Lutheran, and Catholic, that tend to support a more egalitarian model. Now, the outlier in this is the Catholics, though they continue to support a more complementary model, but there's such a stigma in the Catholic Church around divorce that I think that stigma is what is preventing people from getting divorced. But what this tends to say is that there's some dissatisfaction with that model if there's at least a correlation between a complementary way of doing things where men have roles and women have roles and dissatisfaction in the marriage. Now, down below, this is the one where I just have to scratch my head, but it was a legitimate study that was done, and the data is from 2000. But at the University of Minnesota, they surveyed over 20,000 couples and asked them about their lives. And one of the correlations that was made is that those who had an egalitarian marriage, 81% of those people reported having a happy marriage or being satisfied with marriage. Those who had the more traditional complementary, men have roles, women have their roles, 18%, only 18% of those said that they had a happy marriage. Now I find that very, very hard to believe, but it was, pretty well documented, and it's a peer-reviewed study. The sociologist who did it was this Dr. David Olson from the University of Minnesota. So any thoughts about that? I thought I'd bring in some statistics on how this plays out in our present day. Well, if not, let me go back and talk a little bit about a conundrum. Because we have made it sound as if you read Paul's authentic letters, you will see a completely egalitarian understanding of the roles of men and women. And then as you move into the conservative Paul, you start to see that slip away. And finally, the reactionary Paul, you see women have to be submissive and have to be completely silent. However, if you read 1 Corinthians, you will note very clearly that Paul does tell women that they need to be silent. Let me see if I'm sorry, I should probably, I have it written on the next page here. But I want you to remember what we just read, 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15. Women have to be silent. They have to, they should not have authority over a man. And then let's read 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Now, this is one of the authentic letters, right? This is one of Paul's authentic letters. And I'm probably going to have to read it because I've got your, let me see if I can get out of this really quickly. This is one of Paul's authentic letters. And the context is, this is right after Paul has been talking to the Corinthians about there are some people in the church who had certain gifts that looked to be, more thought of or better thought of than others. You had some people who were prophesying. You had some people who were speaking in tongues. You had some people who were preaching, and they wanted some direction from Paul on what is the best gift. I mean, who should we give authority to? And then Paul gives this wonderful metaphor in 1 Corinthians 12 about the church should be like the body. And it's wonderful metaphor. And the hand can't say to the foot, I'm not better than you. We can't all be a hand, or we can't all be an ear, or because where would the eyesight be? So the gifts in the church are like the parts of the body, hands and arms and feet and eyes and ears. But the head of the church is Christ. And then Paul turns around in chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians and says, but if I were to give you some guidance on this is the best gift of all. And this is where he goes into his little, probably the best known scripture from Paul, and that's 1 Corinthians 13. If I spoke in the tongues of men and angels, but had not love, I would be nothing but a sounding gong. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious, it does not notice when others do it wrong. And finally, and these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Now, then he goes into talking about how some of the gifts in the church can be used. And this is where we get this these verses 26 through 40. This is chapter 14, right after the love chapter. And, he talks about speaking in tongues, but I'm just pulling out this little section, verses 26 through 40. Let me see if I can read this in a way that's going to make sense. For you all can prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all be encouraged. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to prophets. God is a God not of disorder, but of peace. And then he says, as in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there's anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in the church. Or did the word of God originate with you, or are you the only ones it has reached? And then he goes on, anyone who claims to be a prophet or to have spiritual powers must acknowledge that what I'm writing to you is a command of the Lord. So, my friends, be eager to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but all things should be done decently and in order. Well, this is curious, and because we've just upset our whole thesis, right? That the authentic Paul was egalitarian, and that the reactionary Paul was very, very hierarchical. And in fact, if we read 1 Timothy, it almost sounds word for word like what we've just read here. Women need to be silent. They ask their husbands if they need to know anything. So I thought I'd give you just a brief little exercise in textual criticism. Borg and Crossan do this, but it is in kind of a cursory way. But I thought I would spend a little more time on it because this is what biblical scholars do. So somebody comes to you and says, well, your whole thesis has been messed up, Dan. Paul has, even the authentic Paul is saying that women should be silent in the church. And so what we have to do is to look at the text itself and ask some questions about the text. And there are three criteria that Borg and Crossan use. The first one is probably the most telling. If a text appears to have a break in continuity, we actually saw some of this when we looked at the Gospel of John. If it looks like the text is moving along as following a nice little logical argument, then all of a sudden, boom, something's thrown in, and then the argument picks up again, where it left off. There's a possibility there that something has been spliced into the text. And this is what we see in the text that we just read. There's a break in continuity. Paul is talking about prophesying and how important it is in the church. Then all of a sudden, boom, by the way, women, shut up. We don't want you talking because this is what the law says. Then boom, again, we're back to speaking about prophecy. It seems to be out of place. It goes from prophecy to women being silent and then back to prophecy again. So there seems to be a break in continuity. Another thing that biblical scholars will do is they will see, okay, is this attested in the earliest manuscripts that we have? And if you are reading your New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which is the Revised Standard Version of the Bible is the text that is based upon the most reliable and earliest manuscripts according to scholarly research. And beginning in the I think it was the 50s or 60s, scholars would get together and they'd pore over these manuscripts and come up with an authoritative text of what was the most reliable with respect to its historical precedents. If you go to an early manuscript, what do you find? And if you read your NRSV, your New Revised Standard Version, you will see that this pericope, this section, it's not really a pericope, the section that I've marked in red is written in parentheses. Why is that? Because it does not appear to have occurred in the earliest texts. Or if it has appeared in texts that are relatively early, it doesn't, sometimes it comes at the end of chapter 14 and not where we find it here. So there's obviously some shenanigans going on, right? Because this little section hasn't found a place when we do find it in, relatively early manuscripts, but the earliest manuscripts don't have it there. And finally, if you're reading the whole of 1 Corinthians, which many people don't do these days, they don't read the entire letter and think about themes that are being developed. What they do is they usually pick out a few verses and they quote them and call it good. But this statement that we've just read, women be silent in the churches, it contradicts earlier statements that Paul is making. And we've already seen this in the authentic letter to 1 Corinthians. He's talking about women in the household and having reciprocal responsibilities and rights in the household. The same in the apostolate. And so to throw this little section in just doesn't seem to be consistent with the rest of the letter. So that being the case, I keep saying Spong, I don't know why. Borg and Crossan make the argument, and they do it rather quickly, and I wanted to make sure that we understood what they were doing, that this was most likely and very clearly placed in 1 Corinthians at a time when scribes were writing, let's probably even the 2nd century and or even the 3rd century or later. We know it was probably after Titus, which would have been the early 2nd century, because lo and behold, it almost sounds exactly like what Titus says, right? So they probably picked up that section from Titus and spliced it into the earlier letter of Paul in 1 Corinthians. Now, remember, the scribes were the ones, were writing, for the church and trying to maintain the authority of the church. And at the time of the splicing, the church was moving toward a much more patriarchal understanding of itself. And so they thought, boy, we better throw this in or we're going to be in trouble. And that's probably what happened. I hope that makes sense to you all. Any comments about that?
Excuse me, Dan, are there any versions of the Bible that you know of that make this explicit? For example, to compare it to, my Bible is the old Revised Version, and the copyright, on that was done like in 1948.
Yeah.
And in that, the last verses in the Gospel of Mark, for example, are clearly set forth in a footnote as something that was probably an addition.
Right.
And I know that I think there are versions of the Bible that talk about the epilogue of John being added. And I know that scholarship in general, I think, is developing to the point, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that John itself is the work of many editors, probably compiled together. Do you know of any version of Pauline letters where the version or the translation make that clear?
Yeah, actually, the HarperCollins Study Bible that I'm using,
that's what I'm looking at.
with students. This is in parenthetic. It's in parentheses, and you think, well, why in the world those parentheses? And you go down and you read the annotation. Let me just read the annotation here for you. Some scholars, here's what it says about the parentheses. Some scholars are being very, very generous, regard the instruction for women to be silent in church as a later non-Pauline addition to the letter, more in keeping with the viewpoint of the pastoral letters. See 1 Timothy 2:11 through 12 and Titus 2:5, then of the certainly and then of the certainly Pauline letters. And then they give you other references. See Ephesians and the Colossians, the places that we've already talked about. So even in the Pauline letters, you see some of that. We're more familiar with it, I think, Mac, because of the Jesus Seminar, right? We're more familiar with it in the Gospels. The first ending of the Gospel of Mark, or the most, and the Johannine edition. But we also see it in Paul as well. And this is a good one to point out, especially these days when there's such a hubbub over the role that women play in the church. I mean, the Southern Baptists just voted on this, right? It's like, absolutely not. We're not going to do that. Well, they hold to a very conservative view of Scripture, and they don't rely upon some of the historical critical analysis that we're doing here, because it challenges them too much. It seems like you're challenging the word of God, which fell from heaven, and that's not how Presbyterians look at it. So
I'm glad to hear that the casual reader of a Bible who uses a version that's not older than they are, as I apparently am, can have that.
That's right. Well, let's move on. We're about it. I'll conclude with that, and just this last section on Paul. We're concluding the chapter 2 on how to read a Pauline letter, and the argument is that over time, when we read the Pauline letters, we see this very clear de-radicalization of Paul. There's a lot of similarity and symmetry between issues like slavery and women in the authentic Paul, and then we read them in the the reactionary Paul, and they're saying different things. And the only way we can explain this, and I don't know how somebody who is a biblical literalist explains these things. They do all kinds of logical gymnastics to get around it, but this makes perfect sense, and if there's anything the Presbyterians are about, and that is faith seeking understanding, that using reason to inform faith is certainly what is expected of any human created in the image of God, which is all humans, right? So here's the concluding section written on page 58. It is that similarity and symmetry that convince us of the overall and deliberate de-radicalization of Paul as we move from the authentic letters through the disputed to the inauthentic letters. As we move, in other words, from the radical and historical Paul to the conservative and reactionary pseudo-Paul, or even anti-Paul. And I thought I would show you this image, speaking about reactionary, painted by a man, Jacques de Rousseau, obviously French, but look at the year, 1636. And if you kind of place yourself in history, knowing that in the 16th century, you have the Protestant Reformation that's going on. And then there was a reaction to that Reformation in the church called the Counter-Reformation. And this is what gave rise to the Jesuit order in the church. And they were seen as the soldiers for the Pope, ensuring that the faith remained pure. And that, of course, we know how that played itself out in, what Peter Bruegel, the elder, paints some of the massacres that take place. The massacre of the Innocents, for example, when Counter-Reformation Vatican-supported troops move into areas that are, considered to be Protestant or Protestantizing, and then basically slaughtering them. But here's what a French person, a French artist, how he depicts Paul in the middle of the 17th century. Look at what we got here. First of all, he's wearing this kind of tunic that looks like one of the orders, if not a Jesuit order. He's reading his Bible. He's got interesting little eyeglasses on, which Paul would not have worn. Eyeglasses and optics would have come in with probably in the 13th or 14th century. And then he's got this sword, right? Carrying the sword of faith. Now, Paul talks about putting on the breastplate of righteousness and everything. And this is probably an allusion to that. But the sword-bearing Paul certainly looks more like a early 17th century rendition of who the Catholic Church would like Paul to be, instead of who the actual Paul was. And of course, reading a book, we know that Paul wasn't doing a lot of that. Most likely, it would have been these scroll manuscripts, if anything. So I just thought I'd share that with you because everybody's got their take on Paul, and this is certainly one of them. So, any questions or comments as we move from chapter 2 to chapter 3? Okay. Leave it that. Well, let's move on and let's talk about chapter 3. The life of a long distance apostle is the title of the chapter. And some of this while we were waiting for our books to arrive, I covered much of it. So I, do not want to, spend a lot of time in redundancy, but there are some important things that Borg and Clausen bring up that we can spend some time with. And the first part of this is that they want to talk about first who Paul was prior, just generally prior to his, Damascus Road experience. And then in the midst of his Damascus Road experience, which they titled Between Tarsus and Damascus, and then Paul, the missionary journeyman, and how his mission differs from that of Barnabas, and some really interesting analysis of how Luke writes about Paul and the model that Luke uses, actually based more on Barnabas's strategy for mission than what was probably true of the actual Paul. And so the comparison of Luke's understanding of Paul and Paul, what he says about himself in his letters, is really very complex and also, yields a lot of great insights. But as you know, Paul was born in Tarsus, present-day Turkey. Tarsus was a port city, and he was born probably around 8 of the Common Era. And I have no idea how they determined that. But that would make Paul about 10 years younger than Jesus. Probably not likely that, they ever crossed paths. But he was a younger man than Jesus was. And how many people have suggested that geography, and not just biology, but geography is destiny. We are shaped by our geography. I think about that every time I drive out onto the plains of Nebraska, thinking about my sense of identity and my sense of centeredness, even when I lived in the Appalachian Mountains, right? And with lots of trees and lots of, interesting plants and lots of rainfall and all of these things. And then coming out to Nebraska, right? And the way I live in Nebraska is quite different. Some of my expectations of living in Nebraska are quite different than what they were when I was in Tennessee. I mean, we have a landscape that is just expansive, incredibly expansive. More sky than you could possibly imagine. Seeing distances in ways that were just impossible when you're caught in the holler there. And so my geography, my place in the world has shaped my perspective on the world. And I could probably go into that a lot more if you were interested. But all of this to say is that we often take for granted that the place that we live is just kind of a irrelevant, if not unimportant aspect of our lives. But we are who we are by virtue of where we are, and this is definitely true of Paul. And Borg and Crossan make this very clear, and they say that there were 3 gifts that were given to Paul as a result of his landscape, and then one not so welcome gift, what we'll call it one disadvantage. And the first of these gifts, and if you can just think about what you know about Paul and his letters and his egalitarian understanding, the authentic Paul of the world, and the way that there are so many gifts that can be used in the church, that there are many parts to the body, that diversity is a good thing and it should be celebrated as long as it is celebrated in love. How much of that grew out of this idea and this reality that Tarsus was really the crossroads of Semitic and Greek culture? Paul, we know, was a Pharisaic Jew, and he was raised with Torah and understood his self with respect to his obligations to the 613 mitzvot, the commandments that were expected of him. But he also grew up hearing and speaking a language different than what his religious language would have provided. You read the Torah in Hebrew, but if you were going to go out into the world now in the Roman Empire, the administrators were speaking Latin, but because of the Hellenization that took place under Alexander the Great 300 years prior to this, the common language of the people was Greek. So if you had a diverse population, just like English tends to be today in most parts of the world, you would have a primary language, but then you would have a kind of a language of commerce, and Greek was that language. And Greek offers a worldview that's quite different than the Hebraic language. Hebrew is a very simple language, and it's beautiful in its simplicity. But Greek is very, very expansive. They work with synonyms, for example, and well, the Hebrews do too. But there's a reason why Greek philosophy and Greek language grew up together. Greek lends itself to philosophical and abstract thinking, and Paul would have had that advantage as an educated Jew. Now, if we compare Jesus and Paul, Jesus would have come from a rural district, even though he was in a place, Nazareth, that was very close to a Greek or a Greek-speaking town called Sepphoris. Jesus was probably pretty insulated with respect to the language that he spoke, mostly Aramaic, like this. Paul would have spoken Greek and would have been educated, would have read some of the Greek tragedies, and maybe even, certainly had studied Greek rhetoric in some respect. And you can see this in his letters, right? He is using all of the tools of Greek rhetoric to try to make a point in a way that Jesus doesn't. Jesus speaks in the great, metaphorical fashion of the Hebrew rabbi. But Paul, he does work in metaphor, but he's pretty clear. In case you're not getting my metaphor, this is what I'm saying, right? He doesn't leave anything to chance in terms of interpretation. Borg and Crossan also make the point that this geographical landscape was not one that was easy to live in. There was a lot of labor that had to go into, this plain, which moved from the Mediterranean all the way up to what was known as the Anatolian steppes or the highlands, and holding and keeping the marshes at bay, for example. And so Paul would have grown up in a culture that was focused on, if you want to get something done, you put your shoulder into it, right? You work, you do, life is not going to be easy for you. You do the work. And of course, as I just mentioned, the education that Paul would have had as a young man, we know that, we see that even in his letters. The form of the letter that he writes was typical of the Roman letter of his day. But there's one disadvantage. There's one disadvantage that our authors speak about, and it's one that I'd never thought about before. Because of the situation between, the ocean and the plains, and with lots of marshes, what comes with marshes, and that's mosquitoes, right? And mosquitoes carry, well, a number of diseases, but the one that's most typical is malaria. And malaria is something that you have bouts with, as I understand it, throughout your life. You can be infected at the age of 12 and, you get over it, but it could keep, the symptoms could keep coming back. I didn't know that until just recently, and reading this book and thinking about it, and reading a little bit more about it. And Paul says something that's very curious in his letters. If you read between the lines, especially in his letter to the Galatians, you will see that during his second missionary journey, when he's on his own, he speaks to them and says, "Oh, remember way back when, where I wasn't feeling that well, and you took care of me, but and despite all of my illness, you still listened to me." And then elsewhere, he talks about this thorn in the flesh that he must carry. Crossan and Borg are making the argument, or make the argument, that throughout Paul's missionary life, he would have been overcome with these bouts of malaria. And this is the thorn in the flesh that he talks about. Let me see if I can find this very, very quickly. Therefore, to keep me, I'm reading Galatians. Oh, this can't be right. Oh no, this would have been First Corinthians. There's not 12 chapters in Galatians. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness." By the way, it's 2 Corinthians, not 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 12. And actually, this comes right after Paul's explanation of that journey he takes up into the third heaven, where he encounters things that cannot be spoken. But lest he become too elated in that experience, he's kind of brought down to earth by these frequent bouts with some sort of illness that he just simply refers to as a thorn in the flesh. And it's interesting how they explain malaria. And I'm going to read from page 64. Our answer depends on another earlier book by William Mitchell Ramsey, is St. Paul the Teacher and the Roman Citizen. He combined Galatians 4:13 and 2 Corinthians 12 and proposed that Paul's recurring illness was a species of chronic malaria fever, which, now here's the example of what Paul would have experienced. This chronic malaria fever, which tends to recur in very distressing and prostrating paroxysms whenever one's energies are taxed for a great effort. Such an attack is for the time absolutely incapacitating. The sufferer can only lie and feel himself a shaking and helpless weakling when he ought to be at work. He feels a contempt and a loathing for self, and he believes that others feel equal contempt and loathing. Boy, this sounds certainly like something that would have taken Paul out, this decrepit man that I am, right? But was this the thorn in the flesh that Paul would have experienced? And Borgencrossen make a pretty good argument that this is the case. It's interesting that, let me stop there. Are there any comments or questions about this? It's interesting in recent years that some authors, with a particularly LGBTQ perspective, have suggested that this thorn in the flesh may have been Paul's homosexuality. There is some scholarship out there that tries to make reference to intimations of homosexuality in Paul. We certainly know that he wasn't married, and throughout his life, which by the way would make me homosexual too, because I've never been married. But arguments are made that this thorn in the flesh was this struggle that he had with this this orientation that was not accepted at the time. But frankly, I think the malaria argument is a much greater one, especially when you consider Paul's geography. And so we know a little bit about what Paul's general life would have been like. What about between Tarsus and Damascus? Getting more specific, Paul was a Pharisaic Jew. And according to Luke, Paul was schooled by a rather progressive Pharisaic rabbi by the name of Gamaliel. And you might remember, if you've read the Acts of the Apostles, when Peter and the apostles are brought before the council because they are proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah, they're in Jerusalem, right? And they're creating quite a disruption. The council says to them, what should we do with these guys? I mean, let's get rid of them. Let's try to, quash the rebellion. And Gamaliel says, look, if these men, Peter, James, and John, and the others, are truly speaking with the Spirit of God, then there's nothing we can do to quash this movement. However, if they are not speaking in the Spirit of God, then their movement is going to die out on its own. That's pretty progressive, right? Now, this is interesting because if Paul were truly a student of Gamaliel, he was not following Gamaliel's advice in this, because we know shortly after this that Paul is out trying to, round up these Christians and, for the threat that they pose to the Pharisaic understanding of the law. So it's questionable whether Luke's understanding of Paul's relationship, Luke is just not very consistent there. Or Paul, if it's a historical Paul, isn't consistent, not listening to Gamaliel's advice on this, because we know that he was out persecuting Christians. Another interesting thing, this is the place where Borgencrossen began to compare Luke, who wrote the Acts of the Apostles, which is essentially a kind of a journey narrative of Paul's missionary journeys. He goes from here and to here and has these encounters along the way. But what Luke says about Paul in the Acts of the Apostles oftentimes doesn't match up with what Paul says about himself. We know at the end of the Acts of the Apostles, when Luke is causing some problems in Jerusalem, and he's brought before the tribunal, he claims that he's a Roman citizen, right? Hey, I'm a Roman citizen. I've got rights here. I want to be tried before the emperor, or I'll be taken to Rome. And so Paul is taken, by fits and starts on his way to Rome, claiming this Roman citizenship. But nowhere in the authentic letters does Paul make any kind of claim about his Roman citizenship. As we read on, page 68, Paul himself never makes a single reference to the status as a Roman citizen, and admits, in fact, that 3 times I was beaten with rods. That would be illegal if he were a Roman citizen. So why did he allow himself to be beaten with rods if, as a Roman citizen, that would have been a privilege he had not to be beaten with rods? Being beaten with rods was something that was saved for the non-Roman citizens. A Roman punishment forbidden to be used on Roman citizens. Indeed, like Luke himself seems to have forgotten that when he has Paul and Silas beaten with rods. So here's Luke making a lot about Paul's Roman citizenship, and yet he's writing about a time when Paul and Silas are beaten with rods, okay, which is not something that, a Roman would have ever experienced, right? All in all, therefore, Paul was either A, not a Roman citizen, or if he were, he never used the privilege for his own advantage. And indeed, that abstention could be the far more important point. He never used, if he were a Roman citizen, he never kind of claimed that privilege for his advantage. But that leaves us with the one question: why was Paul such a zealous persecutor of Christians? And it seems to be that the thing that really piqued his ire was the preaching that the Messianic age had begun. That's what Peter, James, and John were preaching. And in that Messianic age, there would be no distinction between Jew and Greek, between Jew and Gentile. And that would mean that the Gentiles could be included in God's grace. And that was something, according to Spong and Crossan, on page 68 as well, that Paul was not willing to accept just yet. He did not want the Gentiles, in this new Messianic. He did not want to believe the Messianic age had begun. He did not want to believe that Gentiles could be a part of the fold of the chosen people, and therefore was persecuting those who were claiming that the Messianic age had been initiated in Christ. But then he has this Damascus Road experience, and a new dawn, a new day opens for Paul. So that's where I'm going to have to leave it. When we return, we will probably pick up around page 70, and hopefully finish the chapter, because we've talked a little bit about this in our preliminary discussions. So, any comments? Well, perhaps I'll see some of you tonight at the, sipping a root beer float, checking out some of the cool cars that are around. And I'll see you next time. I don't believe I have any kind of conflict that'll keep me from this. By the way, I wanted to show you, this is actually this photograph on the screen is the Roman road that went through Tarsus, about the so-called Appian Way, that enabled Rome and to take its legions of armies from one part of the empire to another in rapid fashion, which is also the inspiration for the German Autobahn, by the way. But this is the Roman road that Paul most likely would have walked upon in his day. The the ruins in Tarsus that can still be seen today. I don't know if any of you have been there or not, but it sure looks kind of cool. So, all right, well, I will stop or share here. And I guess I'll see all of you very, very soon next Wednesday.